Gibraltar is blessed with a rich variety of natural and human history. The rock and the town below have been home to many cultures and people over the centuries. The artifacts, monuments and memories that remain become our heritage, a common inheritance which we all share. And as Gibraltar moves forward and grows, it is up to us as a society to make sure this heritage endures and becomes a part of our future as well. Leading this effort is the Gibraltar Heritage Trust, an independent statutory body entrusted with the preservation of our heritage, whose aim it is to ensure that modern Gibraltar retains history and heritage at its heart. The ritual act of burial, to inter the mortal remains of a person in the ground, has been a tradition in almost every civilization to ever have existed. Cemeteries represent a sacred place where people can be laid to rest and their memory hewn into stone. But as time passes, often these burial places can be forgotten, as those who passed fade away from memory. Such has been the fate of Witham's cemetery. Long neglected, the Heritage Trust has, since 2016, been embarked on a significant effort to honour and restore this hallowed ground.
Well, I'm Keith Farrell, the Vice Chairman of the Gibraltar Heritage Trust, and I've been in the Trust for about 7 or 8 years now. This is Witham Cemetery. A lot of people in Gibraltar don't really recognise it because it's often not visible by most people because they're either passing by car, and unless you live around this area you're not really aware of this location. It's also known historically by several other names, including the Officers' Cemetery and Sandpit Cemetery. But the one that we are familiar with now is Witham Cemetery, as it's within the area of Withams. Captain Witham was one of the main officers in the Great Siege. I don't know a great deal about him particularly, although he was well known by Eliot and various people that we are familiar with from the Great Siege, and he stayed in Gibraltar after the siege, and he certainly had a lot of this area as his own territory, and it was called Wiggins Gardens. So and much of this carried on further up the hill, so this area it used to belong to Withams, and it's been named after him, although the history of when it was purchased and sanctified as a burial site and so on is still undiscovered, and that is one of the things that we need to look into in greater detail. The fact that this cemetery was called the Officers' Cemetery in a sense points to sort of the predominance of who was buried here during the sort of first 2/3 of the 19th century. So it's, most of the graves date from around the early 1800s to around 1860s. And as called the Officers' Cemeteries because primarily officers were buried here of the British Army and Navy if they died at sea and may have been buried here. There's also families of these individuals, wives and children, and there are many children buried here in the cemetery. And in addition to that, there are other dignitaries. The Chief Justice of Gibraltar was buried here, and we have other, doctors for the forces and consuls and people in the sense of the establishment. So maybe not directly employed by the army, but related to the administrative side of Gibraltar of that period. It sort of ceased to be an active cemetery during the sort of latter half of the 1800s, and because of that as people died and families either were repatriated or fizzled out, in terms of, because they would have been expat families, the actual individual attention to the cemetery from relatives, etc., as you would perhaps see at that North Front, disappeared. And it was under the Ministry of Defence, or at the time the War Department, until probably the early 60s. And after that it became part of the responsibility of the Gibraltar government, or the City Council at the time. And it really just went downhill after that, and it suffered neglect, hooliganism as well, and you can see that there are many of the marble inscriptions have been not damaged through age, but just through vandalism. Plus the fact that plants have grown in graves and have caused destruction. The mortar that keeps the building blocks together has deteriorated, so bit by bit it's just become, over the years, an eyesore, because people have thrown domestic rubbish from around the area into the cemetery, and of course as it hasn't had any care been taken of it to any great extent, although for a period there was some attention to it, people have just ignored it and used it as a dumping ground. The cemetery has been on our radar for quite a long time. It has really just been receiving periodic attention, particularly on Clean Up Gibraltar days. The thing that really has prompted us is that when I was chairman of the trust, I was getting some strong feeling, particularly from the Friends of Gibraltar, that this was an ongoing sore in our historical context, and that it needed to be attended to. The trust has been involved particularly with the volunteers for 2 years. The developers of the Plata Villa development and the surrounding buildings that have been built with it had an obligation to contribute the early stages to the trust's refurbishment of the area, and that's actually happening now at full swing. And the trust felt that it was worthwhile moving in with volunteers, even though it was quite slow at the beginning, with the idea of establishing the concept of volunteering in this kind of scenario, refurbishment, restoration, whatever you want to call it. The only way you can really move with some things is to get volunteers involved, get the people of Gibraltar to understand what's happening, and therefore building on the concept, and therefore encouraging other agencies and governments, etc., to eventually get involved. Although at this moment in time, it really is primarily the Heritage Trust, the help from Rafina Electricon, the developers, and the Friends of Gibraltar through donations, and some external donations as well. And together, as I say, we set about carrying this out. We've had some volunteers that have never been involved in any of this, and it's now gelled into a group that is a sort of a stable group, although sometimes we have additional help for short periods from other individuals who come and go.
Subjected to the ravages of time, many of the headstones and graves lie totally crumbled and dishevelled. Today, Charlie and Jimmy try to reassemble one such badly deteriorated grave.
We'll just have to reconstruct it, I think.
These are the sides, these are the pillars. They've all fallen in. Moist.
So that one over there, you can see it's got a middle piece, but if you look at the one behind it, it's only got the corners.
Right.
One in the ground.
Yeah. And this one.
Right, so that gives you...
Yeah, there's the width.
That gives us the width, and you've got a... there.
Yeah, and I'm convinced that this one is a full one.
Yeah, it must be.
Argue you have difficulty reconstructing that.
Oh, great difficulty.
It's going to have to be
you'd have to build
squared off,
yeah,
and keep those original pieces in, and maybe place that in. But it's too high in a way.
I think we can start clearing this area around.
Clear the area around.
Then I think we need to rectangle it off, square it off.
Just square it off. We think this one could have had a metal cage around it.
Oh, has it got the railing marks?
Something here. This one would have had railings around it. It's metal as well. So it would have had.
It was very grand. That has been destroyed no end.
So that would have gone something like that.
And then you'd have had the slab coming
The slab
this way.
coming down that way. Down there.
So yeah, clear it, and then I think that's a question for the mason. I think it's important that we demonstrate the plinth.
Yeah, no,
That's
it's.
the-
I think it's fundamental, the plinth, you know, because it really does delineate and clearly the shape and size of it. Shall we go back to the
Yep.
paths then?
With several sources of varying reliability regarding the original layout of the cemetery, and with erosion shifting the earth and stones significantly over time, an important exercise in organising and making sense of the site has been creating paths and taking stock of how things may have shifted.
We already had the concept in our mind about the paths. With that, we then laid out the paths that were originally on the maps and the information sources that we had. And we went about identifying the tombs, numbering them as per some of the sources of information that we had, and gradually getting to have a feel for the place, because this was a project that had to evolve rather than be all planned and defined from the very beginning.
The pathfinding has proven invaluable for the team's progress in the cemetery, and has even helped in the team unearthing some discoveries.
Well, for example, this grave that you've just sort of stepped over, when we started 2 years ago, this wasn't here.
Well,
This
it wasn't visible.
It wasn't visible, yeah, it was here, but you can see the level of dirt to that height, and that was over the top of it. So by marking paths out, this is where we then go, hang on a minute, there needs to be a grave here, and then we can target our attention to here, and you discover.
And what's more important, this is one of Wellington's men who fought in the Peninsular Wars. So, you know, this is where the history side of it becomes increasingly interesting, particularly if you start to coordinate certain sort of tombs and look at lists of people who fought under Wellington during the Peninsular Wars.
It's graves like this that give a longevity to the cemetery being here and visible, because people want to come and see these. These are the big graves that draw people in. Cemetery tourism is a huge industry.
Yeah,
There are people that travel the world to come and see.
And it's, you know, the whole sort of digitalisation of records, census records and so on over the years, and, you know, the ancestry websites have proliferated, you know, very significantly, and people are hugely interested in this, where they find their own family records, and then you start cross-referencing, and it just builds up a whole fascination for the history of it all. I need to remember the exact name of the society, but it's like Wellington's Men or that sort, and they have tried to identify the certain graves, and it's to add to their full inventory of information about their, you know, the historical figures, and he's one of them.
You know, there are some very interesting individuals here, people that have been involved in the Peninsular Wars in particular. You know, many individuals who have been famous outside of Gibraltar and then have either died here because they're passing through Gibraltar or spent some time here. And you know, if you were to eventually do enough research into all or some of the more important individuals, you know, you'd have a historical sort of context which would make this place worth visiting as not only for its serene beauty, but also its future serene beauty. Maybe at the moment it's not very beautiful, but also for the study and realization of the historical information that's buried here.
The building known as Plata Villa has served the community of Gibraltar for decades. Originally a private home, the building was then used as an orphanage. When child evacuees returned to the Rock after World War II, Plata Villa was used as a school for those repatriated children, with the Christian Brothers taking over in 1945, becoming St. Margaret's School. In later years, and up until the 1990s, it was known as St. Joseph's Middle School. In the last few decades, since the building was shuttered, it fell into neglect. In 2015, the developer Rayafina Limited purchased the site via the tender process for a new residential development, with the old Plata Villa at the heart of the project.
About 2 to 3 years ago, the site next door, the old Plata Villa, what had been St. Margaret's School and then later St. Joseph's School, came up for redevelopment. And part of the government's request from potential developers was assistance with the refurbishment, beautification of the area. And with that in mind, the Trust felt that it had some capacity to be able to do a bit more than we had hoped for, and the concept started to build up with regards to what to try and achieve in this area. And the developers are particularly involved with making this a public area by constructing a footpath through the cemetery coming from the upper part of St. Joseph's Road down to the lower part as it comes close to Jumper's building.
With all restoration, it's a case of how far back you go, and as you can see, we went back to brick and then put it back on. It's very difficult to just patch up an old building. I mean, like these ones. You know, you'll always see a bit of damp coming out, you'll always have issues inside, you'll have windows that don't seal. So you have to accept it from day one. You go back to brick, take everything off. So it is a little bit more expensive because you've got to do the taking away before you put back, which generally does cost. And most of the old buildings are in really difficult places to get to. But it's how much money you're prepared to spend on them.
Yeah.
But then you've done it once and it will then last another 100 years. You sort of have an obligation when you take one of these buildings of putting something back. We made sure we put back what we were taking away. Okay, we've built 8 modern blocks, but we were determined to put back the old school back to what it was. It's a trade-off, it's a deal. And this is our heritage, isn't it? This is what we're gonna, I think they'll be gone before that. Probably someone will change their idea what they want to do with them, and that will still be there.
Being an important British port at the mouth of the Mediterranean, as well as a military garrison, Gibraltar has been home to several significant individuals over the centuries. Witham Cemetery is the final resting place for many notable and distinguished people, both from civilian and military backgrounds.
My name is Charlie Lugaro. I've been a trustee of the Gibraltar Heritage Trust for the last couple of years, and in that time I've been working here at Withams with Keith and a group of volunteers in trying to restore this historic cemetery into some sort of area which can be used by the public, seen and enjoyed. The people buried here, historic, there's a whole range of important people buried here. Of the over 230 graves that there are here, about 20% are children. A lot of them dying in the yellow fever epidemics in the early 1800s. Many thousands died during those epidemics, especially 1828, there are quite a number here. But one estimate puts it at over 2,500 people having died during that outbreak. Now I would like to take you on a tour of some of the more important, at least the ones I find interesting, characters who are buried here from different areas and walks of life at the time. So this is a grave of Jacobi Duff, or Sir James Duff, who was the British consul to Cadiz. And on the 12th of November 1813, James Duff became a baronet. He died in Cadiz in 1815, but he had been unmarried. His title passed on to his nephew, William Gordon, who took on the additional surname of Duff. It was William Duff Gordon who erected a grave for his uncle. Now, what is of greater interest is that Sir James had entered business in 1772 with Thomas Osborne Mann, who had moved from Devon to Puerto Santa Maria, Cádiz. They started a sherry business, and nearly 100 years later, Duff heirs sold their shares to the Osborne family, and today the wines are known as Osborne. We're now in the northeast corner of the graveyard, and this is an area where there's been a large accumulation of debris, which is creating problems in uncovering the graves. This one we were working on yesterday, and this one belongs to Richard Harvey Boys, who was a midshipman on HMS sloop Fontaine. On the 12th of May 1846, he and the crew were involved in recapturing an English merchant brig called Ruth, who had been taken by Moorish pirates. This had a valuable cargo and was beached under Cape Tres Forcas. This is a rocky isthmus just to the north of Melilla. The isthmus with marine pirates was attacked by them, and one group went off and killed a large number of pirates, and they recaptured the ship. However, 8 British servicemen were injured, and luckily only Richard Harvey Boys died, and he's buried here. However, what's missing, the stone tablet on top with a inscription, we believe is over there. It's on the wrong grave at the moment, so eventually it will have to be moved back. That is according to the records and the maps and the information that we have. This is the grave of Dr. Charles Wallisson and his wife Maria Teresa. They were natives of Toulon, France, and they came to Gibraltar in 1794. And in 1801, Dr. Charles became the first editor of the Gibraltar Chronicle, and for 54 years after that. And what's interesting is what he wrote in the first edition in 1801. On the 15th of May, and I quote directly from it, he says, "We trust that under the guardianship of the divine governor of the universe, the commerce of Britain will flourish in spite of his machinations. Her glory will never rise so high as where she stands singly, and the valor of her intrepid sailors and soldiers will perpetuate her fame and protect her coast." Now, to me, I think this shows 3 things. First of all, he had a market, the garrison, that he had to sell newspapers to he had to pander to them. Secondly, very importantly, I think it shows the importance of Gibraltar at the time and the growth of the British Empire. The Gibraltar Chronicle was first issued on the 15th of May 1801, but didn't become a daily until 1821. But of course the main market was the garrison. It was a garrison newspaper at the time. Okay, so this rather impressive grave behind us with the railings around it is of Sir James Cochrane. Now, he was Attorney General in Gibraltar from 1830 to 1841, and then in 1844 became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, what is interesting about Sir James is that he had a house built in the 1840s in the area of Glenrocky. When they were building it, they discovered a cave, which they then called Judge's Cave. Now, to this cave, there were 2 very important visitors. One was Captain Gorham, and the other one, Mr. George Busk. Captain Gorham, we know, later had a cave named after himself, an important cave, and George Busk was the man who took the skull of the Gibraltar woman to the British Museum in the UK. It's only in the 20th century that they realised the importance of that skull. So this is the grave of Sir Edmund Creswell, Sr. Now, the 3 generations of Creswells were in control of the Gibraltar's postal system for a total of 80 years. Sir Edmund and Sr. came to Gibraltar in 1822 and took up employment with the Packet Agency. With his wife Susanna, they had 7 children. When he died in 1831, he was succeeded by his son Edmund Jr. It is Edmund Sr. and his wife, along with the 2 daughters Elizabeth and Mary, who are buried here in this grave. Both girls died during the 1828 yellow fever epidemic. Elizabeth died aged 17 on the 28th of September, whilst Mary died aged 19 a week later on the 5th of October. So that particular autumn was bad in terms of the number of people that died during that epidemic. Edmund Jr. went on to marry, and they had 13 children, all christened in the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. Edmund Jr. in 1857 amalgamated the packet agency with the postal service to create the Gibraltar Post Office, and for this a new building was erected in 1857 on Main Street, and that is the current post office building. One other thing about Edmund Jr.'s sons, so it's now grandchildren of Sir Edmund, was that he went on to play football for the Royal Engineers. He played in the first ever FA Cup final. This was played at the Kennington Oval. He played for the Royal Engineers, who lost to Bolton Wanderers 1-0. Unfortunately for Edmund, he was injured, broke his collarbone, but had to carry on, as in those days there were no substitutes, and he played out in the wing with no particular active part. The Cresswells were a successful and highly achieving family.
The initial timeline has never been particularly fixed because obviously several things dictate the speed at which this project has been moving and will move. I don't think a project like this will ever finish as such, because ultimately it will need care, and as a green area, perhaps a useful comparison might be something like Trafalgar Cemetery in the future, which is still cared for. This place is special, certainly for me, and I know that all our volunteers have developed an affinity and an interest which almost goes beyond the obvious. It is hallowed ground. It's a place of burial, and you know there are so many people, nearly 300 people buried here, mothers, children, husbands, and all of them no longer have anybody to care for their graves and to show the respect that they are due. I think it's important to remember that these individuals came out to Gibraltar as part of their commitment to the forces, that they were in the army or the navy or in the consular brigade. They were doing things for this place. They died here, some of them very tragically through illness, through the various epidemics, particularly the yellow fever epidemics of Gibraltar. So therefore, I think we're obliged to provide some ongoing care of their memory.
So green and shaded and beflowered is the dell, that were it not for the emblems of death that there rise from the turf, you would take it for a pleasure bower. On that Kelpian peak, mourn not, that Britain's chieftains lie. It is a home, that fairy spot, holy and high. There murmurings from the fitful sea lull to profound repose. Young flowerets blush, and many a tree in fondness throws its shadowy arms athwart each grave, whilst every odorous breath that fans the turf which wraps the brave seems wooing death. There, ramparts of the cincturin wall echo the sentry's tread. There shell and mortar, gun and ball speak of the dead. There, passionless, each hero sleeps, whilst over his sylvan grave wild, solemn battle music sweeps, blessing the brave. There, the youth doomed to slumber stays, his agile steps to sigh for him, the brother of glad days, gone darkly by. Letters from Gibraltar, July 1830.